Hello my friends, this is Lindy. Welcome to my channel, Magpie Reads, and it's another Friday Reads. Lots of great books to tell you about, but first thing I'm going to start with is some Canadian Literary Awards. I feel like it's my job now to let you know about these. The Governor General Literary Awards were announced this past week, and I have talked about some of these books on my channel already, including the winner in the nonfiction category, Akiwenzi by Eli Baxter. This was my best book of the week on October 28th. I will link to that below. It's a combination of memoir and a demonstration of how the Anishnaabe culture and language is integral to traditional education for Ojibwe people. Next up, the winner for fiction was Pure Color by Sheila Heti, and I talked about that the week of September 16th. That was my best book of the week. Very pleased to see her win. Recently, Eric Carl Anderson was talking about the best books of 2022 according to the BBC, I think it was. I will link that video below. But when he got to Pure Color, he said, even after reading the descriptions of the book, he still couldn't figure out actually what it was about. I have to say, it's not really what the book is about. It's more its style and feel, because it's an existential novel in an experimental style, and the language is just so sweet, so thrilling. So if you are a language person, pick up Pure Color. And in the illustrated children's book category, the winner is The Sour Cherry Tree by Naseem Hrab, and the illustrations are by Nehithaw Kazemi. Naseem Hrab is a Ukrainian and Iranian Canadian, and Nehithaw Kazemi has a master's in painting from Tehran, and she's published more than 60 children's picture books. One other one by her that I particularly love is called Over the Rooftops, Under the Moon, and it's by John Arnold Lawson. You can see that she's used sort of charcoal grays, except for the little girl who is in bright orange. And it is a story of dealing with a grandfather's death. It opens, I bit my mum on the toe this morning. Not too hard, just hard enough to wake her. My Baba Bozorg forgot to wake up yesterday. He lived alone, so no one was there to bite him. I really wish I'd been there. She and her mother go to her grandfather's place. You can see little details like his eyeglasses, his tissues on the nightstand, a photo of the little girl's mother with the grandfather when they planted the sour cherry tree that's outside. She's jumping on his bed. So they're her memories of her grandfather. Baba Bozorg's favorite teacup is sitting on the kitchen counter next to his samovar. He liked hot Ceylon tea with a splash of rose water and a fig cookie. I don't really like fig cookies, but he always gave me one, and I always took one because we didn't share many words. Very quiet, lovely story. Before I get into telling you about the 6 books that I finished this week and the 2 that I abandoned, I want to tell you about this exhibit that I went to at the Edmonton Art Gallery. Actually, I went through the whole gallery, but there was an opening of the Children's Gallery, which features the art of Christy Belcourt, an Indigenous Canadian who I've talked about before on this channel. And this is the gallery where you can touch everything in there. And the show is called Wapakwanawin, which in English is To Bloom It Has Many Flowers. And you can see here that the title is in both Cree syllabics as well as Roman orthography. And inside, I would describe it as a contemplation of our connection to nature. So while I was at the gallery, I went to see the other exhibits, and I was very pleased that within the various exhibits, there were also other Indigenous artists included. For example, in the new acquisitions, there is these large format photos by Laurie Blondeau, who is Cree, Saulteaux, and Métis. And if you don't already know, the red dress represents missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In the Road Trips exhibit, there was a piece by Terence Houle, who's a Kainai. This is a video installation that includes rear view mirrors that reflect the video onto the wall. It's very cool. It's called Your Dreams Are Killing My Culture. And then there was a huge exhibit that was all to do with scents, like odors. And one of the pieces was by Roland Soulière, who is Anishnaabe, and she created 4 limited edition fragrances to evoke each of the 4 directions. There was tobacco, sage, cedar, and sweetgrass. And to experience the scents, there were these Rolodexes. You'd open it up and then slowly turn it, and the scent would waft out. There was also this planter box full of cedar trees. That was another installation by a different artist, but it perfumed the air with the smell of cedars, as you can imagine. So that was on Sunday that I went to this opening. They had an elder, a Métis elder, and she spoke to us. She blessed the exhibit. It was just a lovely event. And on Wednesday, November 16th, that is a day that Métis people in particular commemorate Louis Riel, because he was executed on that day in 1885 for high treason. And basically, he was the leader of the struggle for the Métis Nation to achieve self-government. The Red River settlement, which was, I think there were about 15,000 people in the 1870s, mostly First Nations, Métis, and some Europeans. Then when Canada purchased this great big area of land that's now, I think, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, they bought it from the Hudson's Bay Company. And then, anyway, so the people who had settled there, they were farming, they were hunting bison. They tried to negotiate with the Canadian government about land use, and instead soldiers were sent. The RCMP was sent out. So there was a ceremony at the Alberta Legislative Building, and I was very moved. I grew up in a Francophone community, and in Canada, within the Francophone community, Louis Riel is widely recognized as Canada's greatest folk hero. One thing that I often forget is that St. Paul, the town nearest to our farm, was originally a Métis settlement until the Catholic Church decided to move off the undesirables and sell a bunch of land that had been set aside by the government for the Métis. I think that's how the story goes. Anyway, a short film that they showed at this ceremony was about Riel's Métis soldiers, and they had lists of their names, and I recognized all these family names of people that I grew up with in St. Paul, kids that I went to school with, names like Bélanger and Boucher and Cardinal and Carrière and Champagne and Gervais and Lafontaine and Larocque and Ouellette, Parenteau, Paul, Plante, Tremblay, Trottier, and Turcotte. Yeah, it just made it all the more poignant for me. There were 4 RCMP officers in full dress uniform that were part of the ceremony, and initially I was up on the 3rd floor looking down, so I was quite far away because the main floor was all full already when I got there. And I could see that one of the RCMP officers, he had a single braid of long hair down his back, which is often a sign that somebody is Indigenous. And then later on, when I found a different place to watch and I could see these officers from the front, they all had a look of being Indigenous, whatever that means, except for one who I couldn't tell. But then I noticed that one that I couldn't tell, he was wearing a little Métis sash over his belt, and one of the other officers was also wearing a Métis sash. So perhaps all 4 of those officers were Métis, I'm not sure. But it does remind me of some years ago when I was giving a presentation at the Alberta Library Conference on the topic of Indigenous books that I recommended for teens. Somebody in the audience asked me who these books were for. Were they for Indigenous kids? And I said they were for everybody. I said people will get different things out of them depending on what their background is, but don't expect that you can tell if somebody is Indigenous or not when you are helping them in the library. And after that talk, somebody in the audience came up to talk to me privately, and she was blonde, and she said to me, "I'm so glad that you said that about not assuming that someone is Indigenous or not Indigenous by the way that they look." She said that she was Métis, and she often felt invisible as an Indigenous person because nobody read her as Indigenous except her family and relatives. It's something that I need to remind myself about too. So I just thought I'd mention that. And then last night I went to a book launch at the Glass Bookshop for this little chapbook called Learning Their Names. And it's letters back and forth between 2 women, one in Edmonton and one in Nova Scotia, about a piece of land. And it is the piece of land where I went in September to give a workshop on natural dyeing. So I felt an extra connection as I listened to them read from this. And they started out the book launch with a prayer from a friend of one of the authors who is an Indigenous woman. They also talked about Cree language. There is a line in here. My friend Naomi tells me that the colors in Cree are verbs. And if you watched my last video, the Indigenous Reads, I talked about a book by Julie Flett, Black Bear, Red Fox, Colors in Cree. And in that book, I learned that colors are verbs in the Cree language. Nehithaw. All right, so on to the books that I did not finish. The first one is not too much of a surprise. It's the audiobook, The Shortest History of War by Gwynne Dyer. I listened to the foreword and the first chapter, then I listened to the final chapter and the coda, so in total about an hour and a half of this audiobook. And I realized I was not in the right mood to hear about how people are inherently violent. Not in the mood. And then I started listening to Kate Atkinson's new novel, Shrines of Gaiety. I listened to about an hour of it, and again, not in the mood. I have enjoyed everything I've read by Kate Atkinson, and I have no doubt that when I'm in a different mood, this is a book that I'll enjoy. But it's set in 1920s London in the underbelly, and the central character is a woman who's doing criminal things. Yeah, sometimes you just gotta go with what you're in the mood for, right? So, on to the books that I did finish. This graphic novel, Halina, Filipina, A New Yorker in Manila, is by Arnold, Arre. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is that there are Tagalog words that are not explained, and it's a good reminder that me as a white person in Canada is not necessarily the #1 reader for every book that I pick up. But I was able to get very much out of this. So in this panel, this follows Halina, who's Filipina, raised in the United States, and she has decided to travel to the Philippines to meet her mother's relatives. Her mother's no longer alive, but all of her relatives are still living there in the Philippines. And she meets this young man, Chris, who is Filipino, and they just hit it off so well. So they're driving somewhere, and the car's cut off by a bus. They make a screeching halt, and they get pulled over by the police. So, you know, the parts that I can understand in this conversation, swerving and license, yeah, I assume that's her driver's license. Something about, you know, there was the bus, it was my first time, something first time. Salamat po, I know that means thank you. And then Chris is asking her, I think he's asking her, do you understand Tagalog? And she's going, nope, just a bit. And who taught you? I watched, and she learned from television. And later on, those comedy shows come into it. So the majority of this story is set in 2002, but it opens in the present day and then ends in the present day. It is a romance. Not something I normally enjoy, but the characters are just so well drawn. So we know that Chris has really fallen for Halina. And what's going on with Halina is that she had wanted her boyfriend to come travel with her to the Philippines, and he's barely even finding time to talk to her from the US, never mind travel there to be with her. And this is when Chris first finds out that Halina has a boyfriend. Look at the expression on his face. He's got to go off to the bathroom. Splash some water on his face. Meanwhile, Halina's being very sad. A slice of life, absolutely delightful. Halina, Filipina. And next I read a middle grade novel, The Lost Language by Claudia Mills. It's written in verse, and it's about friendship between two girls who are 11 years old, and one of them has a really strong, forceful personality, and the other one tends to go along with whatever is suggested. And the lost language that's referred to in the title, it's the language of the island of Guernsey. Guernsey, I think it's called. And these two girls decide they want to save a lost language by learning some words and speaking them to each other. One girl, her mother is a linguist who studies lost languages, and her mother has a mental health crisis during the book. It's very well done, also very emotional. But the way that language works and how it's tied to community, culture, and tradition comes up was an aspect that I really appreciated about this novel. Suitable for about grade 5 to adult. Next 4 books are all for Skoden, the Indigenous Readathon. These are all by Indigenous authors, and 3 of them are nonfiction. I don't know if we can count this one. 4 if this one is nonfiction. It's a board book by Julie Flett called We All Count, Counting in Cree. This one starts out with an explanation and also a pronunciation guide. So there's the word for number 1, beok, and gopher. Now, one of the things that I've noticed picture books by Indigenous authors is that the action often takes place outdoors. There's berry picking, there's animals, ice fishing, even lying on the grass outside, hunting fireflies. So lots of layers to experience in this. The concept of counting, the Nehithaw Whalan language, beautiful pictures, animals, talking about community and our connection to nature with activities like berry picking and fishing, for example. I highly recommend this one. And next is an audiobook, a memoir by Cody Caetano called Half-Bads in White Regalia. The author is of Anishnaabe and Portuguese descent. And this, his storytelling style is quite unique. So it opens like this. Ask any half-bad to tell you the story about how their bad half came to be, and they'll probably begin with the buckle. The buckle is a rumble that hijacks the interior faculties to make one think and act without compunction. The buckle attacks the locus of focus and apes the half-bad's best intentions only to play them like a chump chimp. Yeah. He refers to Canada as Little Miss Dominion throughout, and he tells his story from being a very small child of about 3 years old up until about age 16. His dysfunctional family, whom he loves very much, but there were scenes in there that I found hard to listen to. He's the narrator of the audiobook, by the way, but I found these scenes hard to listen to because of the violence. But overall, I would say the book is using humor to tell a very human story about what's actually a pretty average family in spite of all the hard times. And I read another memoir in audio. This one is by Candy Palmater, Running Down a Dream. Candy died last year in December. She was only in her early 50s. And she was Mi'kmaq and European heritage. The woman reading the audiobook is Alia Warbus, who is Huamux. You might know Candy from her television show, The Candy Show. She also had a regular program on CBC Radio, and she used to have a booktube channel long before I had an account, when I was mostly watching Sean the Book Maniac, and sometimes I would watch other booktube channels. That's where I found Candy Palmater. She loved to read so much. I remember her favorite book was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. She's a person with such a giant heart, and her wife Denise Tompkins wrote the foreword for the memoir, and she says that Candy was just doing the final edits when she died. Candy grew up in Point Lenim in New Brunswick. Her family lived on the top of a mountain where her father ran a motorcycle repair shop and a Harley-Davidson dealership. She grew up surrounded by bikers, basically, and it had a big impact on her life. She said it empowered her to work for herself. She was a fantastic storyteller, and that really comes across in this book. She made so many mistakes, and she says one of the themes that she wants to get across in this book is that we need to accept mistakes. She says that she learned a lot more from her mistakes than she did from her successes. She was a lawyer who gave that up to follow her dream of being a stand-up comic and an entertainer. And I am so full of admiration for her, and I was very sad when I learned that she had died. And the final book is Howard R. Johnson, who just died this year. His final book is The Power of Story, subtitled On Truth, The Trickster, and New Fictions for a New Era. You can see that I was struck by many passages in this book. Howard Johnson is Woodland Cree, Nehithaw, and he was a logger. He was in the Navy. He was a miner. He drove heavy equipment. And he said that the story that people had about men who drove heavy equipment was that they were stupid. And he wanted to prove that that story was wrong. So he decided to go to university. And not only that, but he decided to take the hardest subject that he could think of, which is law. And then when he got his first degree, and then he got a master's as well. And he worked for a number of years as a lawyer, did lots of important things before he decided to give that up and be a writer instead. Because he was famous as a storyteller, there was an occasion when an ecumenical group, a multi-faith group, approached and asked if he would talk to them about storytelling. And so he organized this gathering held at his place out in the country near a lake. And they gathered around a fire, and he talked about storytelling. And then made it into this book. And again, it was that he had just finished the final edits when he died. One of the things he talks about is the removal of his people from their homeland, because Prince Albert National Park was created, and so they told the people living there, you have to leave now. And this forced relocation comes up many times in stories from Indigenous people. So Harold Johnson's mother was 12 when that happened. In Candy Palmater's book, she talks about the forced removal of her Mi'kmaq ancestors as well. Now, because I was telling you about the GG Awards at the start of this video, I'm going to read this little passage. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a beautiful story. It should win the Governor General's Award for fiction. It's okay. The Charter, despite its fictional nature, is the best we can do right now. When we organize our society, we use stories about rights. They help to balance things. They only become a problem when people begin to believe that these stories we call rights are somehow fundamental, that they exist separate from us, and that they need to be defended with violence. So the new fictions for a new era of the title, here he's talking about how we need stories to change as we prepare for a new era. We need stories of hope and possibility to nurture us. We need new heroes, environmental heroes, humanity heroes, and social development heroes. He's got a lot to say about writing and the parallels between writing fiction and also writing your own life story, meaning living your life and the stories you tell yourself about it. So on endings, he says, my friend Robert J. Sawyer once told me that he never starts to write a book unless he knows the ending. That was the opposite of the way I had been writing. I started with an idea and found the ending as I wrote. More often, I wrote until I was tired of the story and slapped an ending on it. That's not a good strategy. Sometimes the endings were unsatisfactory. I told myself that endings were hard to write. I told myself that I needed to get better at writing endings. I made a lot of excuses for myself, but Robert was right. The best strategy is to know the ending and write toward it. And knowing where you want to be in your life as well, I guess. Talks about the concept of absolute truth and how that does not exist for a people who are understanding the world as always being in a state of flux and change. Here he talks about kids. When a little person declares, "You are not the boss of me," they are expressing the spiritual imperative that they are in charge of their lives. They should be encouraged. Instead, they are frequently introduced to the concept of parental authority. Sadly, in Western culture, that inborn understanding of self is often beaten out of the child. He explains how governance worked before the Indian Act. And he talks about visiting and the importance of visiting. He says, visiting is storytelling, but it's not gossip. We have very strong admonitions against gossip in our culture. We know that stories are powerful and negative stories can kill. All the traditional teachers I have encountered in my life, all the knowledge keepers, everyone has warned against gossip and taught how it was not acceptable in our original ways of being. We are not only told not to gossip, we are told to not allow gossip into our homes. We know today that online bullying, a modern form of gossip, has resulted in suicides. We shouldn't be surprised. We knew this. We knew that gossip could kill, that words were warfare. I love this book so much. 5 stars, highly recommend. So, that's all I've got to tell you about today. I did spend quite a bit of time this week practicing the skills that I learned in the online vegetable printmaking workshop that I took. I've put together a short little clip for the end of this video if you care to stick around and watch how I carve a chick out of a carrot and do some stamping and stamp some butterflies and paint them with pigments mixed with soy milk. Yeah, it's only about 2.5 minutes long. So thank you for sticking around this far. Thank you as always for watching. I really appreciate hearing from you, so I look forward to your comments down below. Hope all is well with every one of you.